Good afternoon, good morning, good day, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to the SAI event in which we will present the concept of a global minimum transparency standard for chemicals of concern in materials and products, a keystone tool for achieving sustainable natural resource management and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Mafoko Pumani. I am an environmental health campaigner based in GroundWork from South Africa, and I'll be moderating the session. Today's other speakers are Dr. Olga Sparinskaya and Alexandra Katovo, both co-directors of Health and Environment Justice Support. Dr. Andreas Pribotnik, Senior Policy Advisor, Chemical Pollutants and Chemicals, the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation. Bob Diederich, Head of Environment, Health and Safety Division, OECD. And lastly, Michael Stanley Jones, Senior Advisor to the Circular Research Foundation in Italy. Before presenting what elements the standard could contain and how it could be constructed, we first want to put chemicals into the larger systemic picture of production, consumption, and sustainable development. This contextualization aims to help you understand why we need the standard. The world is currently facing triple and interlinked crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Chemicals are directly and indirectly involved in all of them. So in order to fully address the principal drivers underlying these crises, we must first take control over the use of dissemination of chemicals in value chains for materials and products, as I'll explain to you. This is something that decision makers and stakeholders focusing on climate change and biodiversity loss may not be fully aware of. Chemicals have key functions in production and extraction of natural resources and in turning raw materials into higher value products for the markets. They're used as process chemicals in agriculture, mining, extraction of petroleum and gas and natural gas, as well as by the refining and manufacturing industries. At the same time, most of our basic process chemicals are based on fossil feedstock and minerals, and consequently also a driver of these industries. Value chains for materials and products are often multinational and consequently covered by multiple national legislation and jurisdictions. This can make compliance checks, for example, for restricted chemicals in one jurisdiction, a daunting task. Global consumption of materials is expected to double over the next 4 decades, with annual waste generation projected to increase 70% by 2050. This indicates that we are already overshooting the annual sustainable outtake of resources. And simply put, we are on a highly unsustainable trajectory with the economy. This is, of course, nothing new to you. In addition to chemicals, energy and processed water are necessary for most extraction, refining, and manufacturing processes. Approximately half of total greenhouse gas emissions and over 90% of biodiversity loss and water stress come from resource extraction and processing. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has identified chemical pollution as one of the 5 principal drivers behind biodiversity loss. Chemicals may harm the wildlife's reproduction, immune, hormonal, and neurological, as well as physiological systems, making ecosystems more vulnerable and less adaptable to additional pressures. Chemical stress can be chronic or intermittent, but frequent enough to prevent recovery. The chemical and manufacturing industry also have a large carbon footprint. Approximately half of total greenhouse gas emissions come from resource extraction and processing, as mentioned earlier. The chemical industry is the world's largest energy consumer, accounting for approximately 30% of the total energy demand in industry, or 10% of the total global energy demand. The manufacturing industry is also the 3rd largest carbon dioxide emitter, thus a principal driver of climate change. Resource extraction, as well as the associated loss of biomass and biodiversity, may lower the carbon capturing ability of ecosystems, further increasing vulnerability to climate impacts. I would now like to give the floor to Olga Spirinskaya, Co-Director of Health and Environment Justice Support, to talk a little bit more about the solutions to these systemic challenges.
Mental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services has identified chemical pollution as one of the 5 principal drivers behind biodiversity loss. Chemicals may harm the wildlife's reproduction, immune, hormonal, neurological, and physiological systems, making ecosystems more vulnerable and less adaptable to additional pressures. Chemical stress can be chronic or intermittent, but frequent enough to prevent recovery. The chemical and manufacturing industry also has a large carbon footprint. Approximately half of total greenhouse gas emissions come from resource extraction and processing. The chemical industry is the world's largest energy consumer, accounting for approximately 30% of the total energy demand in industry, or 10% of the total global energy demand. The manufacturing industry is also the 3rd largest carbon dioxide emitter, thus a principal driver of climate change. Resource extraction, as well as the associated loss of biomass and biodiversity, may lower the carbon capturing ability of ecosystems, further increasing vulnerability to climate change and climate impacts. I would now like to give the floor to Olga Spirinskaya, Co-Director of Health and Environment Justice Support, to talk a little bit more about the solutions to these systemic challenges. Olga, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mafoko. And next slide, please. Here on this slide, you see a brief list of necessary changes to address the systemic challenges that Mafoko describes. First of all, it is important to ensure that chemicals are safe by design, which means they should easily degrade, should not be toxic, should not bioaccumulate and magnify in food chains. It is also important to improve material resource efficiency, which means to ensure remanufacturing, repair, maintenance, recycling, and safe design of materials and products to reduce overall consumption. And improving material resource efficiency will help develop a circular economy, which is an economic model that will contribute to prolonged product life and help reduce the need for virgin raw materials that will eventually result in less ecosystem destruction and less negative climate impacts and pollution. However, while talking about circular economy, it is important to ensure that this economic model does not lead to recirculation of toxic chemicals in new products and in the contamination of the supply chain. And to avoid this, it is crucial to know what chemicals are in materials. And this is where a global harmonization of transparency standards for hazardous chemicals in products and materials should be developed. And next slide, please. So, next slide, yes. No, before that. So, why is it important to achieve transparency of information on chemicals in products? So first of all, information disclosure of hazardous chemicals in products will help identify products with hazardous chemicals and even determine product components that contain such chemicals. And it will also support safe substitution with non-toxic or less toxic alternatives and inform decisions for non-toxic sustainable product design. And in addition, such information will support informed decisions for reuse and recycling of waste into toxic-free secondary raw material. And next slide, please. There are a variety of initiatives that help to understand whether products contain toxic chemicals. And here on this slide, some initiatives are presented, and we can talk more about this, but the first one here is the intergovernmental system represented by UNEP Chemicals and Products Program. This program was adopted by the stakeholders of the strategic approach to international chemicals management in 2015. And it is a voluntary disclosure program that has the long-term aspirational goal for full information disclosure for all intentionally added chemicals in products within and outside supply chains. And products covered are only manufactured products or articles, not cleaning, personal hygienic products, or cosmetics. And information disclosure here implies that there is transparency about the identity, presence, and ideally concentration of chemicals with hazard properties in products. Another example here is the EU regional database that was developed by the European Chemical Agency to provide greater transparency of information to manufacturers, consumers, and recyclers. And according to the EU requirements, all substances of very high concern from the EU candidate list in concentrations of at least 0.1% by weight of all constituent components of products, including waste and waste materials that is traded to be reused or recycled, must be reported to the EU Chemicals Agency and will be included into this database. And this transparency requirement targets all manufacturers in the European Union, as well as importers of materials and products to be placed on the EU market. Since January last year, 2021, this database displays 7 million searchable article notifications from nearly 7,000 companies across the European Union. So some other examples presented on this slide show different initiatives from governments and companies to establish information systems that help consumers, businesses, and retailers find safer products that contain ingredients that are non-toxic or less toxic to human health and the environment. And as you see, companies set the level of disclosure they want to establish. And this involves deciding how they will meet relevant regulatory requirements and stakeholder demands, and how they will verify the information disclosed. And next slide, please. So the described initiatives have certain challenges. For example, before that, sorry. Yes. So, for example, there are no clear motivation for companies to join the voluntary UNEP Chemicals and Products Program. And industry is reluctant to share information on the chemical composition of materials and products outside supply chain. For the EU SIP database, this is only regional. This database is only regional to the European Union and does not impose same disclosure requirements to products traded outside the region. And also, voluntary transparency schemes from industry are usually limited to transparency for the narrow within supply chain stakeholders, which is an obstacle to sound life cycle management of materials and products. And also, voluntary transparency scheme by industry result in multiple parallel standards, and the information on the chemical composition of materials stays with the certifier. Also, complying with these multiple standards can be a challenge for small and medium companies if they are part of the supply chain. And next slide, please. I may say that for some chemicals, the requirements may vary within different jurisdictions, and even for different articles, whether such chemicals are in new articles, in articles already in use, or in waste. And also requirements in different sectors may vary, as described here on this slide, taking HBCD as an example. HBCD, hexaboron cyclododecane, is a persistent organic pollutant regulated by the Stockholm Convention. And this example shows that there are different approaches to reporting and disclosing information on chemicals in products in various jurisdictions. And this may cause significant challenges, especially in developing and transition economies, which are part of the value chain. And next slide, please. So, so challenges associated with non-harmonized rules of information exchange on chemicals in products include, for example, costly systems for compliance checks at the borders, when developing countries usually do not have nor technical nor financial capacity for a proper check of potential hazardous content of imported products. Also, costly control systems are imposed on the supply chains, as they have to comply with the requirements not only from different jurisdictions, but also from different sectors. And trade between countries is complicated and often results in double standards and dumping of lesser quality products in countries with less ambitious chemical legislation and poor enforcement. So also some jurisdictions, mainly developing countries, countries in transition, lack regulations on many chemicals of concern, meaning there are no reporting thresholds or transparency requirements. And as a result, markets in such countries are flooded with products containing toxic chemicals. And in addition, confidential business information is a huge obstacle on the way towards transparency, and the industry is unwilling to share information on the chemical composition of materials and products, and often hides information under such claims as, for example, non-toxic or contains no carcinogenic chemicals. And it is also challenging to the governments to verify and control industry claims, particularly developing and transition countries lack this technical and financial capacity. Next slide, please. So to add to this, non-harmonized rules of information exchange on chemicals and products contribute to challenges from internet trade. And internet trade is growing and it is largely uncontrolled, and a customer cannot hold the company that runs the internet platform responsible for harm for a product that is sold by a third party. For example, the EU has entered into voluntary agreements with some major platforms to cooperate and to map supply chains of products that do not comply with the EU law. But this is not the case in the most other jurisdictions. And the last slide, please, from my side. Summing up, I would like to say that having a globally harmonized minimum transparency standard for hazardous chemicals in products has clear advantages. And I would like to highlight the word minimum here, as it defines a minimum level of information disclosure. And of course, we encourage companies to disclose more information on chemicals as they need, as it is relevant for their businesses. And what is important is that a global minimum transparency standard puts in place conditions for disclosing information about toxic chemicals inside and outside supply chains for materials and products. And it helps eliminate double standards, and at the same time addresses the challenges with internet trade by putting in place conditions for harmonized accounting for hazardous chemicals in products offered on e-platform and across different jurisdictions and sectors. And it is a tool for improving access to information and a step towards progressive ban of hazardous chemicals in products. And now I would like to give the floor to Andreas Privodnik from the Swedish Society of Nature Conservation to share our vision of construction and elements of a global minimum transparency standard for hazardous chemicals in products that we are discussing today. Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olga. Can we please go back to the previous slide, Alex? Thank you. Yeah, so the first question is, what chemicals should we include in the transparency standard? In the short term, we suggest to start with already regulated or widely recognized chemicals of concern. And this includes chemicals from global treaties, progressive regional legislation, or chemicals from internationally recognized lists. Justifiably, we can call them all chemicals of global concern, and consequently, no confidential business information claims are justifiable. We believe that this is a realistic approach to begin with, so that negotiations to put the standard in place do not become unnecessarily lengthy or complicated. The next slide, please. So this infographic shows the element that we suggest to include in the standard, namely the POPs banned under the Stockholm Convention, the organic and inorganic compounds listed in Annex 8 of the Basel Convention, and in the future, potentially also the plastic additives that have been proposed to the parties of the Basel Convention for consideration. The mercury compounds banned or restricted under the Minamata Convention, the 114 chlorinated and brominated compounds under the Montreal Protocol of the Vienna Convention, carcinogenic or suspected carcinogenic compounds listed by the WHO International Agency for Cancer Research, the EU ROS chemicals, and finally also the EU substances of very high concern, the latter currently 223 chemicals. Chemicals from all suggested elements share one or several of the hazard properties prioritized for information disclosure according to the UNEP Chemicals in Products program. Furthermore, with very few exceptions, there are no formal transparency requirements in place for the mentioned convention. So in this respect, the GMTS would make a difference. And as the underlying treaties, legislations, and lists are updated, so would the GMTS be. So it would be a living list. Further down the road, we could also consider to develop complementary GMTS-specific criteria for additional chemicals of global concern that are now not captured by any of the existing treaties. The next slide, please. So ideally, the standard should be binding from the very beginning. We can create a soft standard, that is to say a standard that only discloses the identity of the chemicals, or we can create a hard standard where the disclosed chemicals are also restricted or banned. And of course, the first approach does not exclude the second approach. So we could start with a soft approach and then later on move on to a hard approach. The next slide, please. And to initiate the process of developing a binding standard, we probably need a decision from the UNEA. And for this to happen, one country or a group of progressive countries need to take the lead and propose resolutions. And we hope that this could take place in connection already with the next UNEA meeting, that is to say UNEA6. It should also be investigated if the standard could be hosted by any of the existing treaties in order to make the best use of existing administrative and financial arrangements for an existing secretariat. But if this is not a viable option, we may need to consider to create a new treaty. Yet another option would be to create a standard like the GHS, the globally harmonized system, which is voluntary, but once adopted international legislation becomes binding. However, drawing upon the experiences from GHS, this is probably not the preferred option. The implementation of GHS globally is rather heterogeneous, partly because different countries have adopted different versions of the standard. Can we move on to the next slide, please? In parallel, we suggest to work for the inclusion of text about the GMTS in the targets, indicators, and milestones currently under development for the successor to the UN chemical strategy, SAICM. How this could look in practice, you can see in our white paper that is downloadable from www.globaltransparency.org or from the outcome document from the discussions in the virtual working group 1 in the SAICM post-2020 process. If included in the successor to SAICM, it would send an important signal of the need for a globally harmonized transparency standard. And at the same time, it would also be an important instrument to support national implementation plans for the issue of concerned chemicals and products. And for this to happen, we need a decision from the ICCM5 meeting later this year. Theoretically, the standard could probably be developed entirely under the successor to SAICM, for example, as part of a reinvigorated UNEP Chemicals and Products program. However, experience from the UNEP Chemicals and Products program, to which very few companies so far have joined, shows that a voluntary instrument is insufficient to make the necessary progress as quickly as we need. So we believe that this approach should not be the first option anyway. And with this, I hand over the floor to Alex Catabo from HEJSupport.
Thank you, Andreas. Yes, so for both options, the binding and the voluntary approach, we need several things. So first of all, we need a multi-stakeholder committee, which is free from the influence of commercial interests or conflicting interests. It should be ideally coordinated by the Inter-Organization Program for the Sound Management of Chemicals, IOMC, and tasked with the development of a transparency standard. The format of the standard should also follow several criteria. The most stringent disclosure threshold should be considered. It should have a cross-sectoral approach. The standard also, as been said previously, has a living nature, so it should be updated when underlying conventions, regional legislations, and lists are updated. It should also have the option to develop complementary criteria for chemicals of global concern using a chemical group approach to respect the precautionary principle and speed up the listing of hazardous chemicals. There are several ideas that we think are important for the data administration and distribution. So the data administration should be centralized in a secretariat for the multilateral instrument hosting the standard. Similar a little bit to the arrangement for the SIP database within the EU Chemicals Agency, and it's of course called ECHA. It should be decentralized and distributed data administration with the owners of the data responsible for keeping it in the decided format, not the ones who are administering the data. With both data administration formats, we suggest that the information is distributed to the stakeholders that need it in the form of an electronic system. For instance, it could be similar to the idea that is now under the development in the EU of an electronic product passport. Of course, it should be a simple electronic system that can be accessed by everyone. And it should also work in many in all low and middle income countries. So how to support the GMTS idea at UNEA? So we think that parties to global MEAs should, and not only UNEA, but also other MEAs, should recognize the link between the lifecycle management of materials and products with the sound management of chemicals inherent to materials, which of course requires transparency of hazardous chemicals in materials and products. So this is a call that is for us very important and should be highlighted in global MEAs related to chemicals all the time. They also should send clear and strong signals to UNEP or the UN General Assembly of the importance of the GMTS idea as a keystone tool for the transformation of the economy, which is necessary to meet the systemic challenges causing pollution, loss of biodiversity, and contributing to climate change. So we already saw that it's not very likely to achieve, we haven't achieved the 2020 goal, and also the SDGs in terms of chemicals seems to be difficult to achieve. The parties should propose resolutions to UNEA with a call for the development of a binding GMTS, either as part of existing conventions, if possible, to enhance synergies and take advantage of existing administrative or budgetary arrangements, or if necessary, as a new standalone multilateral instrument. The scientific bodies of the MEAs, like the POPROC or the CRC, progressive and responsible companies and industry associations should repeatedly highlight the benefits of the GMTS idea for addressing the systemic challenges behind pollution, biodiversity loss, and climate change, so that the idea is mainstreamed at the international and national levels. And there are, of course, progressive industries that are also benefiting from GMTS, because their whole supply chain would be transparent. So, and with this and our additional contacts and additional information, you can reach out to us. And with this, I like to hand over to Mafoko.
For making a very strong case for the need for global minimum transparency standards, and how highlighting the benefits of how the standards will contribute to curbing biodiversity loss, climate change, as well as pollution. I would now like to give the floor to Bob Diederich, who will be highlighting the feasibility of GMTS. He is the head of Environment, Health and Safety Division, OECD. Bob, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I couldn't find, once I had my screen up, I couldn't find the mute button anymore. Let me see. Can you see my screen? Does it work? Super, thank you. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. So I've been asked to provide some reflections on the idea of the global minimum transparency standard for hazardous chemicals in products. Is this wishful thinking, or is this feasible? Can this be put into reality? So just taking a slight look backwards, when it comes to information on chemicals, we have come a long way. We are able now to easily find information on the hazards of chemicals through internet portal like eChem portal. We are available to find information of releases of chemicals from hazardous installations through pollutant release and transfer registers. And we are able to find out which hazardous substances are included in mixtures in those countries that have implemented the GHS. So quite a lot of things have been achieved regarding information of chemicals. Although not all countries have a PRTR, not all countries have implemented the GHS. And there's still a lot to be done on that front. So the next frontier is about information on chemicals in articles. Now, I think the reasons for why this is a good idea has been explained. The circular economy is, of course, a big driver. We don't want to have chemicals ending up in products that they were not intended for, or if they do, we need to make sure that we can assess the risks from those unintended uses. So we need to know. Of course, consumer and worker protection is an important aspect. provide here the example of firefighters. And I'll just give you the example of what's happening in Canada right now. In Canada, firefighters are pushing very hard to get to find out what chemicals are used in furniture, because they want to know which chemicals they are exposed to in case of fires. So what about technical feasibility? I mean, Olga has already mentioned a few systems that already work. She's mentioned the SCIP database regarding the tracking of hazardous chemicals in articles and products in the European Union, which was actually initiated through their waste legislation. So the driver here comes from the circular economy. Some of you may have heard of GMTS, which is an electronic standard for gathering and transmitting data on chemicals in products through the supply chain. This is a standard that has been developed in Japan and which is being used on a voluntary basis by a number of supply chains, and it is being maintained regularly. Olga has already mentioned the car industry, which have implemented the IMDS for transmitting information on all chemicals in the supply chain, with some exceptions. So the car industry does know almost all chemicals which are used in the production of cars. One of the drivers here was to be up to date at any point of time about which substances are regulated anywhere in any country around the world. So here clearly the driver was the regulation of chemicals. This is of course possible because the auto industry is very homogeneous, and collaboration is facilitated. Some of you may have heard that there are a number of service providers now who are providing solutions for moving information on chemicals up and down the supply chain based on blockchain technology. This has the advantage that you don't need a trusted third party. For the automotive industry and the IMDS system, all information is stored centrally and maintained centrally. But in case where you don't have a trusted third partner, blockchain may be a solution because all information is certified and safeguarded through the blockchain technology. You don't need a centralized storage and maintenance system. What are the hurdles? We've already mentioned some of those. Confidentiality claims are of course a recurring theme, and indeed, if you limit the system to a number of highly hazardous substances or a number of substances of very high concern, depending on how you want to call them, the confidentiality claims would not apply. What we have to take into consideration are the heterogeneity of the sectors. As I mentioned, with the car sector, it seems to work well, but that is because the car sector is very, very homogeneous. And the more complex and dynamic your supply chains are going to be, the more difficult it will be to comply with such a standard. If your products change every 6 months, the overhead of complying with such a standard are going to increase and are going to reduce compliance with such a standard. For voluntary systems, lack of pressure on the supply chain is of course a big issue. If your supplier is 10 times bigger than yourself, you have no possibility to put any pressure on them to provide you with any information on any chemical in any of their products. So that would be another argument towards a legislatively mandated system. Of course, and I mentioned the more complex the articles, the more difficult it will be to comply. So this means that legislative reforms will be needed in countries if we want to move towards such a system, which will be long and which will not be very easy. But to tell you the truth, I think this is an idea whose time has come. It is the next frontier, and we need to seriously start thinking about it. What could be the possible role of IGOs in this configuration? Either be it a voluntary standard or be it a centrally legislative mandated standard. It could, of course, be the development and maintenance of the electronic data transfer standard. It could be the development and maintenance of the list of the substances that are covered. I'll just give you an example. This is currently done by the OECD for PRTRs. If a country wants to set up their pollutant release and transfer registers and want to have an idea of what are the chemicals that should be covered under the national PRTR, the OECD has a recommendation of what is a minimal list of chemicals and what would be an extended list of chemicals that could be covered. Another possible role of IGOs, which Alexandra has already mentioned, they could be the trusted third partner for the data, be it collection, storage, and dissemination. Of course, collection and storage would only be possible if it would be implemented through an international agreement, a mandatory agreement. But you could also think about a system where a distributed system where it's governments who collect and store the information and the dissemination is organized internationally. Like we have, for example, today with ECAM portal and the dissemination of safety information on chemicals. So these are just some reflections from my side, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
The comprehensive presentation and highlighting the challenges related to supply chain complexity and the need to have legislation reform in order to support GMTS. I'm going to hand the floor over to Michael Stanley Jones, who's Senior Advisor at Circular Research Foundation, to further build the case for GMTS based on the work that's being done by various bodies. And perhaps also he will touch on the opportunities for collaboration and actions for GMTS. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all the presenters for informative presentations. I've taken some notes. I'll be commenting on some of the points raised. I first want to voice a disclaimer. I'm here on behalf, I'm here in my personal capacity, but also as a senior advisor to the Ethico-Scientific Committee of Circular Research Foundation in Parapita, Italy. Circular Research Foundation seeks to combine research and technological innovation in the direction of the circular economy and with a view to environmental and social sustainability. It's a new foundation. It's just gotten started, a startup, if you will. And it is based in Parapita in Puglia, Italy. That's the southeasternmost part of Italy, very near the Mediterranean. So a beautiful place. I hope you can visit Puglia someday. And my status there is in Atessa. I'm transitioning to the foundation. Currently, I am with the Ecosystems Division of the United Nations Environment Program. So many of you might know me as a UNEP officer, but I want to make clear that I'm speaking not on behalf of UNEP, not even on behalf of the foundation necessarily, but in my personal capacity as a 35-year advocate for chemical safety. Next slide, please. I wanted to begin with some comments on how the public perceives information about chemical safety. In 2016, a Eurobarometer survey was conducted on chemical safety with more than 25,000 citizens participating in that. And the results were, in some ways, at least for me, surprising. 2 in 3 respondents said that if they were asked if a product contains hazardous chemicals, they thought the seller of the product was required by law to provide them with this information. This brings to mind an initiative in California. I'm a native of California. California's Proposition 65, the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act of 1986. As long ago as 1986, this initiative was adopted by the voters, the citizens of California. And it created a list that contains a wide range of naturally occurring and synthetic chemicals that are known to cause cancer or birth defects or other reproductive harm. And there's the requirement that these labels, these announcements of these risks, of these chemicals rather, be actually presented to the public. So if you go into a market in California, some of our visitors are surprised to see that there are these Prop 65 warnings on certain common household products, foods, drugs, dyes, solvents, pesticides, and other synthetic and occurring chemicals in products. So in a way, this idea of having a transparent list of chemicals in products is a long-standing one, and it is practiced to a degree in the state of California. Back to the survey in 2016, about half of the respondents thought that chemical products were safe. Nevertheless, 90% of Europeans are worried about the impact of chemicals on the environment, and 84% of Europeans in later surveys said they were worried about the impact of chemicals in everyday products on their own health. So although generally many citizens of the EU believe chemicals that are in products are safe, there is still quite high concern about them. NGOs in the survey in 2016 thought that REACH, that is the EU regulation on registration, evaluation, authorization, and restrictions of chemicals, that REACH's potential had not yet been fully developed. In particular, they were worried about poor quality of registration dossiers and insufficient information on safe use of chemicals. Next slide, please. We already heard from 2 of our speakers about the Chemicals and Products Program of UNEP, which was adopted in 2015 by the International Conference on Chemicals Management, that is SICAM's governing body, Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management's governing body, as an emerging policy issue. And that program does continue, but we heard some criticisms of it. I'll, next slide, mention that you can still access HAZMIC's regulation repository on UNEP's website, on the Chemicals and Products web pages. That was developed with chemreg.net. It's a database that voluntarily captures and provides information on chemicals that are regulated globally. It had grown since its launch to 2018 to cover 26,000 global regulations of chemicals from 133 countries. However, my look at the system recently shows that it hasn't been updated since 2018. The UNEP chemicals and products web pages, and I do mention that I've managed quite a few websites in my time, itself hasn't been updated in 5 years. So there is a problem, a recognized problem with keeping information up to date, particularly in the chemical sector, as it is a sector that evolves rapidly. A vast amount of information that has to be managed. And these systems of repositories that are voluntary, that provide information by the industry itself, they're not robust in my view to capture. And that's why we've seen, as Bob illustrated, that there have been more of a regulatory authorities approach to publishing information, authoritative information on chemicals and their hazards. Next slide, please. The EU Circular Economy Action Plan in 2015 led to the adoption of 54 actions adopted by 2019. So this is part of the EU Green Deal. That action plan addresses chemicals, and I wanted to highlight a couple sectors where it or a couple chapters. Next slide, please. Particularly interesting for textiles, which in this chapter 3.5, the goal of making products fit for a climate neutral, resource efficient, and circular economy is called out. And in boosting the reuse and recycling of textiles, it would be very useful to have products with their material constituents, their chemical constituents, that is high impact intermediary products, chemicals in these products to be identified. Chapter 4.2, next slide please, of that action plan explicitly talks about circularity in a toxic free environment. Let's move forward. Next slide. Parallel to this highlighting of textiles as an area of emerging concern, some initiatives I just meant to mention on tracking chemicals in clothing and advocacy around those topics. It is a problem. The apparel sector, the textile sector, is a large consumer of pesticides in the production of fiber, particularly of cotton, and these can be harmful to the environment. There are chemicals in fabrics. Consumers should know about them, especially those who wear blue jeans, for example. But heavy metals, brominated flame retardants, these are just among the different types of constituents that are used in the production of fabric, in the finishing of fabric. And there can be residues also. So in the case of brominated flame retardants that Olga mentioned, California's attempts to regulate this. Bob also mentioned that the firefighting community has been very adamant about finding out information about BFRs because of the risk to their staff as they do their duty to put out fires. Upholstery is one class, but also just ordinary clothing, baby clothes in California were found to have high levels of flame retardants in them, and that required regulatory remedies to be applied. There are arguments on both sides why you should have flame retardants in fabric, but also why you should not. So there's concerns, and these concerns were among those that were highlighted by the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion, which is an interagency coordinating body that was launched at UNEA4. So I guess we're now celebrating the anniversary, one UNEA later, of that effort to get 9 UN agencies to speak with one voice about these issues, including the issues of chemicals, hazardous chemicals and pesticides in the value chain. This is also a topic highlighted in the Sustainability and Circularity in the Textile Value Chain Global Stocktaking Report that UNEP issued in 2020. Next slide, please. The EU is consulting with the public on options to address the interface between chemicals, products, and waste. A report was published in March of 2019 on this. 4 issues were highlighted in their canvassing about these concerns, and substances of concern in recycled products stood out as one of 2 of the 4 highlighted issues from that. Stakeholders were worried about the issue of legacy substances. And this goes to the heart of circularity. If you're not sure, or if you fear you have hazardous materials, hazardous chemicals in material that you wish to recycle, you're less likely to do so. And it breaks the circular value chain that we're trying to create. Next slide, please. In 2020, the European Commission published a chemical strategy for sustainability towards a toxic-free environment, also part of the EU Green Deal. And currently, I want our audience to take note of this, there is a public consultation on the REACH regulation open until the 15th of April. So that's an outgrowth of the chemical strategy that the EU has put in place. So why are these, next slide. Among the key actions are things that largely are in line with the transparency initiative that we're discussing today. But I want to point out one of the key actions in particular, and that is for the strategy and for the EU's initiatives to play a leading role globally by championing and promoting high standards. So what we've seen, and the reason I've spent some time talking about the American, the Californian, and now the EU initiatives is that this has been building and explicitly has the ambition of becoming a global resource for transparency in chemicals and products. Next slide, please. So we've already seen these arguments on why we need a global minimum transparency standard, and that there are still very dangerous chemicals in our products life cycle, and that these are leaching to the environment, either from the waste system or through incineration, entering our air sheds, entering our groundwater, and entering us, as we've learned from the analogous problems with plastic waste. Microfibers of plastic are entering all of our bodies globally. You cannot find a point on Earth now that isn't contaminated. These chemicals, as the introduction to this session made clear, they are harming wildlife, they're harming ecosystems, and they're breaking down the resilience. And so that's one of the causes, or one of the reasons we have not achieved the Aichi biodiversity target to curb pollution. The UNEP organized report, the Global Chemicals Outlook 2 in 2019, called for full material disclosure of products. And this is to minimize potential future releases and to generate secondary raw materials in a circular economy. So the policy thrust is clear. Next slide, please. The advocates for the GMTS are tackling these issues through transparency. Harmonized global disclosure along the whole product life cycle, the defining of minimum level of information disclosure, and legally binding are key elements of tackling this problem of transparency. Next slide. I only meant to include this to show that this is no longer just an EU or a North American or an OECD countries issue, but we actually see in the signatories for the report, the white paper on the GMTS for hazardous chemicals and products, signatories from 16 organizations, including from New Zealand, from Brazil, from South Africa, from Africa. It is a global issue, not just one parochial to this region. Next slide, and last real substantive slide. We've already looked at voluntary versus legally binding strategies or pathways to achieve this standard. I was quite interested in seeing the reference point to the multilateral environmental agreement secretariats. UNEP hosts many of those. Stockholm, Rotterdam, and Basel conventions in particular, Minamata Convention also. I wondered why Rotterdam Convention's prior informed consent procedure was not also a reference point for the work on the GMTS. Prior informed consent procedure is one of the oldest in this field, and it is one that FAO and UNEP jointly host. And it is explicitly an information exchange convention. So I think the analysis could benefit by weaving that in. But I'll close with a more up-to-date tool, and that is the new action plan that's being released this coming week, Accelerating Action Toward a Sustainable Planet in the Digital Age, which has been developed by the Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability, which is partly led by UNEP. It is a UN Development Program initiative, but it in fact is a huge coalition working on digital economy, digitalization, and trying to direct its resources towards environmental sustainability. So chemicals is one of the themes of this strategy. I think that by catching the wave and joining forces with the digital community that cares about environmental sustainability, that there could be more momentum for GMTS. Thank you very much. Last slide to say goodbye. And there's our blue bird of hope, and there's our rather menacing looking COVID-like sun. Climate is under stress, but we still hope with these tools, transparency can support sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for sharing some of the resources, the global resources that support GMTS and the strong policy presence that already exists. I like the idea of needing to join forces, which you made quite strongly there in the end. I would like to open the floor for a broader discussion to our participants. And probably to do that, I suggest anyone can kind of put their hand up and ask a question. But to lead us into that discussion, perhaps Bob and Michael can also weigh in on what they think the biggest benefits and challenges of GMTS are in their region, and perhaps to also address what are the best pathways to get GMTS implemented. I see Jana Kluman has her hand up.
Yeah, hi everyone. Jana from Friends of the Earth, Germany. I have one question. When I hear about the minimum transparency standard, I'm just getting a bit worried if that wouldn't make the full material disclosure kind of put aside and like lower the ambition of this. What do you think about that?
Thank you. Andres.
Go ahead, Olga.
Okay, No. Okay, yeah, Andres, you raised the hand. I didn't notice, or I'm sorry. Jana, just to respond to your question, I must say that, of course, the goal is to achieve full transparency of all chemical ingredients in products. But the reason we start with a global minimum transparency standard for hazardous chemicals in products to be sure that there is no resistance to disclose this information. Because the chemicals that we suggest are already regulated chemicals. And there is no reason, any argument that could be raised while discussing the issue of why we should disclose the information of the presence of this already banned chemicals or already regulated chemicals globally in products. And so that was the reason we suggest to start with hazardous chemicals in products and with particular focus on already regulated chemicals. But as I mentioned in my presentation, for no way we discourage companies to disclose more. Of course not. So any company is very welcome and is encouraged to disclose as much as it can and based on the needs of its own business and its own responsibility. Andreas, you want to add to this?
Thank you, Olga. I think you have covered most of the things that I also had on my mind. I just want to say, of course, we also want the UNEP Chemicals in Product program to continue, and also with new impetus and more energy than it has now. And the ultimate goal of the UNEP Chemicals in Products program is full information disclosure. So we are in no way, discouraging full information disclosure. Rather, this is the ultimate goal also of the standard that we are working on. As Olga said, this is the start. We want to start with something that it's more easy to agree upon among the countries, because these are already regulated chemicals, like Olga said, so there should be no controversy in starting with them, and over time we can build on to the standard and increase the number of chemicals for disclosure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the question is quite interesting. I haven't given it much thought, but it seems to me that the incentive for industry is agility in front of regulatory action. The more information industry has on chemicals in products throughout their value chain, the more agile they will be in being able to respond to regulatory action anywhere around the world. So it seems to me that if we limit indeed the system towards only the most hazardous chemicals, then there's no incentive for industry to do this. They will have to be forced to do it. But increasing, or at least at the minimum, internally the flow of information within the value chain, there's clear benefits for industry in doing so. So we might want to think about how to take advantage of that when moving towards implementation of such standards. Thanks.
Thank you. Andrea, you have your hand.
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to say thank you to all the presenters. I mean, I think the arguments are very clear and very well laid out. My question is, there's a relatively small group of us here today who are engaging with this. And what do you think is the next step? How do we move forward? What is the process to actually getting a GMTS in place? Obviously, you're doing the awareness raising, but what needs to happen more to trigger that the discussion actually gets into the international platforms, and that it takes it to the next level? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for that question. Perhaps Michael, you could attempt.
Yeah, I think in Olga's, actually in several points of the presentations, we had a bit of a mapping of the pathway. The ICCM5, the international conference later this year, twice postponed, would be one place for stakeholders and governments to come forward and recommend that step. UNEA5, the UN Environment Assembly, would be another opportunity to bring a resolution in 18 months' time, calling for the opening of a process to negotiate. Whether it's a treaty or not, I'm somewhat skeptical it could be at this stage a treaty negotiation. It took 10 years to get the plastics intergovernmental negotiating process underway, which we're hoped for as an outcome of this week's work at UNEA. But it is UNEA as a milestone where political will can be galvanized and then expressed through a formal resolution. I don't think General Assembly. I think that UNEA and ICCM would be sufficient. Prior to either of those, you need governments, and probably an array of governments who would come forward and support this. So perhaps 2 countries, one from the global south, one from the developed world, might join forces and try to lead a dialogue on this. Country-led initiatives are important for getting these types of things off the ground. And then we had another consideration, whether there are voluntary steps, as Bob said, that can lead to mandatory steps. That's a strategy that the sustainable finance community is grappling with now, as UNEP is hosting voluntary initiatives that have come out of climate finance community, banks who are signing on to these. And then in their own way, they're formulating what will become the skeleton of future legislation. The third is these leading regional initiatives. So I highlighted quite a few in the EU context, but it's not only the EU. And you can build off of regional initiatives and build support that way, and create a roadmap to move from voluntary enforcement to real enforcement. I hope that helps.
I think, yeah, Mafuka, I think we couldn't hear you.
Bob, please take the floor. You have your hand raised. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, in terms of international work and how to bring this into the mainstream, let me be brutally honest. In a situation where the GHS is still a voluntary standard, to me personally, it does not make sense yet to have this the GMTS as a global mandatory system throughout the world. I think GHS and PRTRs should have priority. Having said that, and in the situation where we are today, the best option is, 1, to raise awareness, and 2, trying to get it into or mentioned as part of one of the targets in the new SciCam, and build an indicator. How many countries have measures to disclose information of chemicals in products, and build up the pressure slowly, so that also IGOs are get to start developing what is the electronic standard that you can put in place, what are good practices, learning from countries. So getting this really into the mainstream, because today this is not in the mainstream. GHS is, but chemicals in products is not quite there. And so to me, we're still at an early stage where we need to work on awareness raising and feasibility and slow push towards countries. But I'm saying that this is my personal view. Thanks.
Thank you. We have Michael on the list and then Olga.
Thank you. I just wanted to react to Bob, again mentioning pollutant release and transfer registers. The experience with negotiating the Kiev Protocol on PRTR to the Aarhus Convention, I think, illustrates one of the strategies that worked in the 1990s, in the early 2000s. And that's that we tied the development of new technologies in internet, in communication, in GIS mapping, to the dialogue and eventual negotiation of the Kiev Protocol. And in a way, we showed that technology has enabled these new regulatory systems to become more efficient to become more popular, widely known, to be rapidly adopted. If you consider that the negotiation of the Kiev Protocol on pollutant release and transfer registers only got underway after 1998, and then was adopted in 2003, and then entered into force. Was it 2006? I should know this history. Maybe I'm becoming forgetful. But the point is very rapid because we wove in the new geographic information system technologies and internet communication platforms as delivery vehicles for those systems. And that's what I think we could draw from the codes, the CODIS work, the action plan that will be adopted on March 2nd here in UNEA, that there is a huge push now for digitalization of the economy, and we need to figure out how digital technologies can support sustainable development in PAR. And here we've seen Bob's example of blockchain. We've seen that the systems that are that have been out there for 10 or 20 years are starting to look quite antiquated. It is really time to refresh them with a technology from Industrial Revolution 4.0. And so that's the hook that I think could speed up the thinking of decision makers at the ICCM, at the UNEA 6, perhaps. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Michael. Olga? Flo?
Yeah, so thank you both, Bob and Michael. Regarding GHS, I should say that the idea of GMTS is complementary to GHS because it covers different products. I mean, GMTS covers articles, not mixtures, not hygienic products, not cosmetics. So it's a different sector, I should say. And it is complementary to GMTS, does not contradict, is not an obstacle to GMTS exception, right? It's an addition or a complement to this. This is the first. The second, what I wanted to say is that referring back to the first, to the previous, very first question about the already banned chemicals, the case is that the existing chemical conventions, we have 4 of them, right? They do not have transparency requirements. Sorry to say. Yes, the Stockholm Convention banned chemicals, and there is only one chemical, HBCD, that has a requirement for transparency of information. No any other, about 30 chemicals, right, have them, these requirements. It means that for developing and transition countries, the implementation of the Stockholm Convention could be very problematic because they do not know what to ban and where. They don't have this information. That is why we suggest this harmonization of sharing information without any borders, without any, I don't know, with everyone equally on a globally acceptable, harmonized way. Yes, and one more thing is GMTS is not like for sharing information only. Let's share information. No, it is like a step towards the elimination and complete phase out of certain hazardous chemicals from products. And actually, again, I will return back to the EU database of substances of very high concern. So manufacturers in the EU must apply for authorization to use any chemicals from the list of substances of very high concern. And authorizations are time limited, but they can be renewed by a new application to the EU Chemical Agency, ECHA, right? But if no authorization is granted to a chemical listed as a substance of very high concern, it gets a sunset date after which it can no longer be used. It means that the listing of a chemical as substance of very high concern is, to our understanding, is a step towards stricter regulation or even complete phase out. but this is at the EU level, and we really wanted to be globally, to have like a level playing field for everyone, despite of the region they live in. Yeah, Bob, please.
No, I fully agree with you. I mean, I said this before. The idea of a GMTS, the time for a GMTS has clearly come. What I think what I'm getting at is for a country who has not yet implemented the GHS, who does not have a PRTR, who does not have a legislation in place that allows it to regulate any chemicals yet. What is the priority? Is it implementation of a GMTS, or should it be first starting with making sure they have legislation that allow them to regulate chemicals? Should it be a GHS? Should it be PRTR? Knowing that today very few countries have managed to move towards transparency of chemicals in articles. I fully agree with the objective. I was just wondering what is the priority for countries that start with little today. But I fully agree. This is something that it is complementary. It is something where we need to get to in the end. It's just a question of what's the transition to get there. Sorry, I wasn't very clear in the beginning. Sorry.
Thank you, Bob. There's a question in the chat. Peter has a question. I can just read it out. How about producing a real example on a consumer product, taking, say, a synthetic fiber t-shirt and try to disclose all of the chemicals used, perhaps process by process? Is there also another complication with the level of impurities in substances? Andreas, you have your hand up. Andreas?
You're muted. Yes, sorry, Mafoko. I did not intend to respond specifically to that. I actually had another comment. So does anyone want to respond to this question?
While we wait for Taker, go ahead, Andreas.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Mafoko. So I was thinking about what Bob said about the way to prioritize different actions. Of course, you need GHS in the very sort of foundation of communication of hazards of chemicals. But putting a requirement in place for GMTS would then also be a spur to put in place GHS, because you need GHS to have a functioning you need GHS to have a functioning global minimum transparency standard. So I think they could mutually sort of spur each other and help putting in place these basic elements. GHS is a basic element for hazard communication, and GMTS is a basic element to support circular economy, which we need to move to in order to have more resource efficiency. So I think the GMTS could actually help put in place also these other elements that are necessary. That's my reflection.
Thank you, Andreas. Go ahead, Olga.
Yes, so thank you, Andreas. But Peter Gors asked an interesting question. How about producing a real example on a consumer product? And he suggests like synthetic fiber t-shirt. Synthetic fiber always has numerous chemicals inside, because synthetic fiber is plastic. It's plastic, right? And there might be many of them. And we do not know what is in there. You know, the Stockholm Convention is planning to regulate UV328, which is an additive to plastic. right? And this is the first attempt to regulate a plastic additive as a persistent organic pollutant, because it meets the criteria of persistent organic pollutants. But there are like thousands of plastic additives, physically thousands of them, right? And many of them have never been tested, as I said in the beginning. So, or I wanted to say, probably I didn't say, but I wanted to say that out of 350,000 chemicals on the market, only a small portion, a tiny portion, has ever been tested for toxicity, right? So what we deal with, we do not know. And that is why we suggest, again, to start with already regulated chemicals, that we should know if they are present in articles. If we cannot resolve this transparency issue with already banned chemicals, it will be a challenge to move on, you know. And for t-shirt, for synthetic t-shirt, we may find brominated flame retardants there. We may find just numerous PFAS, perfluorinated chemicals. We may find many others, right? And this is when the manufacturers have to take the responsibility and their supply chain and provide disclose information on what they put into the products they manufacture, starting with those already regulated, because they cannot like close their eyes and say, we do not use these chemicals. We simply don't have them. Just prove it that you really don't have them. And for this reason, we need this globally harmonized standard for hazardous chemicals in products. And how it will be developed is actually a big discussion point. Do we want to proceed with a family type of chemicals? Or do we want to proceed with chemical by chemical approach? How we see this transparency, a global transparency standard moving forward? And that is also a question for our guest speakers. What do you think? How you see this global transparency, minimum transparency standard developing in terms of its structure, you know, and in terms of what chemical approach you think is more acceptable? Chemical by chemical, or class of chemical, or probably some other?
Thank you, Tamara. I am aware of time. We are out of time. And I'd really like to thank Bob and Michael for this contribution that they've made to the discussion. I hope everyone can still hear me. A lot has been discussed as far as practical steps are concerned. The need to include regional initiatives, raising awareness, and practically setting GMTS as a target in SciChem, as well as developing an indicator for countries to be able to then implement GMTS. Olga, would you like to say a few last words before we go?
I already said so many words today, but okay. So I would very much love to thank our guest speakers. It is so very much appreciated, and your support and your concerns and the ideas that you share, they are really precious to us. And we very much hope that this side event was interesting for everyone involved. And we're looking forward to receiving your comments, your ideas, and please open your heart to this idea and think progressively that we want to achieve safety and transparency, and this is one of the ways forward. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time and for being with us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. That was awesome. Thank you.
Alex, will you be able to?
Yeah, just a second. Okay, I think now it's just us.
No, it's your green room.
Yeah,
green
but
room.
that's the technicians.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so guys, thanks a lot. I think we did it.
Wait, let me stop the, wait. Stop the.